The pseudoscience of religious apologetics. Why atheists are right. Understanding the issue. The debate between atheists and theists has a long and bloody history over thousands of years, with many brilliant minds weighing in on both sides of the issue. It may seem like a daunting task to wade through the many tomes and multiple fields required to gain a meaningful understanding of the topic. However, this topic is a lot easier to understand than you might expect. The entire debate between atheists and theists can be understood by looking at how both worldviews describe one simple term: atheism. So what is atheism? Well, atheists define atheism as a lack of a belief in God or gods. Theists define atheism as a belief that God does not exist.
What atheists say is not that there is no God. We couldn't possibly prove that. We say there's never been any evidence, and there's never been a convincing philosophical argument that there is such an entity.
A number 6, at the other end, is somebody who believes there's a very low probability of God existing, but still not quite 0. I'm a de facto atheist. I can't know for certain, but I think God is very improbable, and I live my life on the assumption that he isn't there.
I don't think atheism is a term we need, and it's not a name that anyone really needs to answer to.
Because what does it mean to you exactly? Is it somebody who's sure there's no God, or?
No. It's somebody, in the same way that somebody's sure that there's no Zeus, you can be sure that there's no God of Abraham. It's not the kind of certainty that says we have proved the absence of this thing. Yeah. It's just that there's no good reason to believe in this thing.
So atheism merely being a lack of belief in God, I think, is a cop-out. An atheist really is somebody who says there is no God.
Brings up the issue of, is atheism a worldview, or is it a subsidiary of naturalism, or metaphysical naturalism as a worldview?
Oh, I don't think it's a subsidiary. Atheism, as he says, is simply the belief that there is no God.
So it is rather silly to say, because it's a word that contains a negative, therefore there's no positive entailments. So atheism is not believing in God.
The reason these definitions are so different is because these two worldviews look at the world from two fundamentally different perspectives. The atheists look at the world from a bottom-up perspective, whereas theists look at the world from a top-down perspective. What do I mean by bottom-up and top-down? Well, the best way to think about these worldviews is to think of the movies The Matrix and Inception. In these movies, there are worlds within other worlds. There's only one true primogenitor world where all others descend from, and all the others are simply descendant worlds. The bottom-up worldview starts from the perspective of the world in which we exist, regardless of whether or not it's a descendant or the primogenitor world. Therefore, truth and knowledge in the bottom-up worldview are always tentative and defeasible, never absolute and always open to revision. This is because if there is a world above ours, whatever we think is true or is happening here in the world we exist may not be true or may not be happening in the world above ours. The top-down worldview starts from the perspective of the primogenitor world from which all others descend. This means that truth and knowledge in the top-down worldview are absolute, unchanging, universal, and never open to revision. This is because no matter how many worlds there may be above ours, the truth in the primogenitor world supersedes all of them and never changes. To summarize, the major differences in these worldviews is that for atheists, truth is what is apparently true about the world we observe around us, where for theologians, truth is what is absolutely true about the primogenitor world of their God. This difference in the atheist and theist worldviews is what causes the difference in how they define the word atheism. Because atheists look at the world from a tentative, bottom-up perspective, they define atheism as a tentative lack of a belief in a God and not an absolute claim that God does not exist. Because theists look at the world from an absolute perspective, they define atheism as an absolute claim God does not exist. So whose definition is correct? Well, obviously, the atheist definition is correct. In philosophy, also known as soft, weak, implicit, and negative atheism, atheists accurately use the term atheism to mean a lack of a belief in a god or gods. Agnosticism is a subset of soft atheism. The theist definition is also correct. In philosophy, also known as hard, strong, explicit, and positive atheism, theists accurately use the term atheism to mean a positive rejection of the existence of God. However, you must acknowledge the definition being used by the person holding the position, or you will be addressing a straw man. This also goes for us atheists. We must accept theologians' definition of faith as they define it, or we will be addressing a straw man. So how can the same word have two contradictory definitions and both be correct? Well, worldviews are like independent languages, and the same word can mean two very different things in different worldviews, just like it can in different languages. This same kind of distinction between tentative and absolute versions happens quite often in the field of philosophy, which is why they've made a way to distinguish between the soft and hard versions of various positions. In philosophy, this is the distinction between the methodological and the metaphysical versions of positions. For example, the most common being that of naturalism, which has a methodological version stating we have no way to methodologically verify the supernatural, and a metaphysical version stating there is absolutely no supernatural realm. So how does understanding this one fact help us to understand the entire debate between atheists and theists? Well, effectively, atheists and theists are talking in different languages. So understanding how each defines terms can effectively act as a Rosetta Stone, allowing us to understand both sides of the issue more clearly. There's a third worldview that's important to mention because it's often mixed in and conflated with the other two. This is the inward worldview focusing on things in our minds rather than the physical world or the primogenitor world. Just like whatever's going on in the physical world isn't necessarily representative of what's going on in the primogenitor world, what's going on in our minds isn't necessarily representative of what's going on in the physical world. This is the worldview of the postmodernists and the constructionists, the relativists, the interpretivists, and so on. As stated before, the best way to think about these three worldviews is as if they are independent worlds. For example, imagine if I said I'm holding an apple. There are three ways I can be holding the apple, one for each worldview. I can be holding it in my imagination, I can be physically holding it in the world we perceive around us, or I can be holding it in the one true primogenitor world. This apple analogy outlines the three worldviews. The first is the conceptual, the world focusing on that which is in our minds. The second is the empirical, focusing on the physical world around us. And the third is the metaphysical, focusing on the primogenitor world. Each of these worlds is totally separate. What I'm imagining is happening in my head isn't necessarily representative of the physical world around us, which isn't necessarily representative of the true primogenitor world. Each of these worldviews is independent from one another, and what's going on in one doesn't necessarily affect what's going on in the others. Just as the worlds are independent in the world's analogy, each worldview is also independent. This is because each worldview has a different definition for truth. Therefore, something can be true in one worldview without being true in the others. Relativists define truth based on what is true in our minds, atheists define truth based on what is apparently true about the physical world around us, and theists define truth based on what is true about the primogenitor world of their God. It's not just atheism and truth. This fundamental difference in the worldviews causes many words, terms, positions, and theories to have vastly different meanings in each worldview. Here are a few examples of such words: nothing, space, time, faith, law, skepticism, God, morality, objective and subjective, free will, who created God, why is the kettle boiling, and why did Aunt Matilda bake the cake? Understanding the philosophy. How everything I said fits into the field of philosophy. Philosophy has two main branches of knowledge, epistemology and ontology. Epistemology has to do with how and what we know, which is evidence or tentative knowledge. Ontology has to do with the true nature of things, or absolute knowledge. The three worldviews can be categorized into these two branches of knowledge. Here's a list of things that occupy each of the tiers of knowledge. In the conceptual, there's math, logic, linguistics, predicate calculus, personal experience, intuition, eyewitness testimony, anecdote, and preliminary studies, which is the formal and social sciences, or stuff in our heads. In the empirical tier, there's methodological, tentative, defeasible, observable, testable, falsifiable, verifiable, and repeatable stuff, essentially the natural and applied sciences, or stuff describing the physical world we perceive around us. In the metaphysical tier, it's the true nature of reality, absolute certainty, absolute truth, and universals, which would include such traits as eternal, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent, because such traits would necessitate ontological knowledge about the true nature of reality. I put an asterisk next to personal experience, intuition, eyewitness testimony, anecdote, and preliminary studies because those are combinations of both conceptual and empirical knowledge. However, the conceptual knowledge, which includes our biases, dilute the reliability of the empirical knowledge in such examples. To quote Robert Hansen, observations vary from observer to observer with the amount of knowledge that the observers bring with them. Therefore, such examples only qualify as conceptual knowledge until we filter out our personal biases via the means of peer review, consilience, and or critical multiplism, leaving only the reliable empirical knowledge. There are many problems and distinctions within the field of philosophy that demonstrate, like the apple analogy, that these tiers of knowledge are totally separate because things can exist or be true in one without existing or being true in the others. Therefore, to be justified in believing something exists in any particular tier, you need evidence from that tier. Here are a list of some such distinctions. To summarize, because the tiers of knowledge are separate, you need to have evidence of the same tier as your conclusion, or you have committed a category error and your argument will fail for the reason of at least one of the distinctions. Or to rephrase, conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence, and metaphysical claims require metaphysical evidence. A similar principle has been stated by many before. Hume said, "In our reasonings concerning matters of fact, there are all imaginable degrees of assurance. A wise man therefore proportions his belief to the evidence." As Carl Sagan put it, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And as Laplace put it, the weight of evidence for an extraordinary claim must be proportioned to its strangeness. Example of how this difference affects arguments. The most common example of how this difference in definitions affects arguments comes in the form of the cosmological argument. When scientists say the universe, time, and space came from nothing, referring to the Big Bang, they are using the terms time, space, and nothing in a tentative empirical sense to mean our space, our time, and nothing we know about. However, theists interpret these statements in the absolute ontological sense of all time, all space, and absolute nothing. The phrase, "the universe, time, and space had a beginning and came from nothing," when interpreted from a scientific epistemological perspective, can be understood to mean our local universe and the time and space within it began to exist from a point when nothing of what is in our universe existed. However, what predated our universe, if anything, may have had its own time and space independent of ours, such as other universes or the multiverse. Epistemological knowledge, the bottom-up worldview, always has the implicit caveat that it only applies tentatively to the stuff we know about, and does not apply universally to all the stuff we don't know about.
We should not think of the Big Bang as the beginning of the universe. We should think it as the end of our understanding of what is happening.
The same phrase, when interpreted from an ontological perspective, can be understood to mean all time and space for absolutely everything had a beginning and came from an absolute philosophical nothing, of which no temporal thing can predate, exist before, or independently from. Ontological knowledge, the top-down worldview, is referring to the true nature of the thing, which applies to absolutely everything, including all the stuff we don't know about. Or as phrased by William Lane Craig, on the basis of the Kalam cosmological argument, it is therefore plausible that an uncaused personal creator of the universe exists, who sans the universe is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful. Scientism is using epistemological tentative evidence to attempt to indicate an ontological absolute conclusion, which is a category error. Apologists often say things like, the universe cannot be eternal, proven by the Big Bang and the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. They also say, whatever caused the Big Bang must be timeless and spaceless, such as minds and abstract objects, and therefore conscious and personal because abstract objects cannot cause anything. These arguments are examples of religious scientism caused by the fact that apologists are misinterpreting the scientific epistemological use of the terms nothing, space, and time in the absolute ontological sense. The Big Bang only indicates the beginning of our space and our time, not all space and all time. The multiverse and cyclic universe could both have their own versions of space-time independent of ours, which may not have a beginning. Therefore, The origin of the universe does not need to be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. It only needs to be made of something outside of our space, our time, and our material. All science, including the BGV, is tentative, and so it only applies to our known laws, principles, and particles, not absolutely everything. Therefore, the addition of new laws, principles, and particles, such as dark matter, dark energy, or quantum gravity, can result in new stable models of the past eternal universe that are immune to the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, because the BGV only applies to our current known models based on combinations of known laws, principles, and particles. The tentative empirical evidence of the Big Bang is insufficient to justify a belief in something that's absolutely timeless, spaceless, and eternal. However, the tentative evidence of the Big Bang is reasonable to justify the tentative conclusion that our universe was created by something outside of our time and our space. The Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is also tentative empirical evidence, which means it's unable to justify the claim that past eternal universes are absolutely impossible. However, the tentative empirical evidence of the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem does justify the claim that we currently don't know how to build models of past eternal universes with our current known principles, particles, and laws in the fields of physics. Understanding the arguments. Even if you have evidence of the same tier as your conclusion, that isn't necessarily reasonable to justify belief in your conclusion. This is because there could be infinitely many other conclusions of the same tier. Therefore, not only do you need evidence of the same tier, but you need evidence that excludes all of the other possibilities of the same tier. The other possibilities to theism in the ontological tier are deism, pantheism, naturalistic pantheism, pandeism, acosmism, transtheism, henotheism, polytheism, an evil god, and of course, Pastafarianism. Even if you have evidence indicating something in the metaphysical or ontological tier, without evidence that distinguishes between all of these different possibilities, any of them could be better solutions than theism. Without evidence that distinguishes between the many possible alternatives, the only way we have to determine the better theory is Occam's razor or ontological commitment. Or in other words, the simpler theory is better. The properties of a theistic God are all-powerful, eternal, conscious, all-knowing, personal, and all-loving. The properties of a deistic God are all-powerful, eternal, and conscious. The properties of naturalistic pantheism, which is essentially the multiverse or cyclic universe put in the ontological context, is either all-powerful or eternal. The properties of panpsychism are all-powerful, eternal, and conscious, and the properties of an evil God are all-powerful, eternal, conscious, all-knowing, personal, and all-evil. Based upon both Occam's razor and ontological commitment, some form of naturalistic pantheism is to be preferred. As a point of clarification, the multiverse and cyclic universe as scientific theories do not entail any absolute properties, and therefore they are not ontological in nature, they are epistemological. However, you can elevate any epistemological theory to be ontological by adding absolute properties to it, which is what I'm doing here when I claim the multiverse and cyclic universe are kinds of naturalistic pantheism. If you prefer to describe God in a different way than the traits listed on a previous slide, simply replace the traits that you prefer into the correct slots. For example, if you espouse Professor Craig's definition of a God, simply replace all-powerful with enormously powerful, and replace eternal with timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and uncaused. Whichever traits you see best describe a God, that will not exclude other ontological possibilities, because ontological theories allow for an infinite amount of ad hoc reasoning due to their absolute nature. For example, if you wanted to argue the spaghetti monster cannot be immaterial because spaghetti is material, I can respond the ontological absolute theory of the spaghetti monster can include the properties such as all-powerful and eternal, which go far beyond our limited knowledge, so I can claim there are many undiscovered properties of spaghetti entailed in the all-powerful nature of the spaghetti monster, such as a supernatural, non-material spaghetti soul, which is related to spaghetti in the same way apologists argue the mind and the brain are related. This same process can be used to justify any seemingly contradictory ontological theory, such as an all-good God who allows evil. The arguments. The cosmological argument. Premise 1. That which begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. Because of the evidence of the Big Bang, cosmological arguments do indicate epistemological conclusions that are not absolute. Such conclusions that don't have absolute properties would include aliens, simulated universe programmers, the multiverse, or the cyclic universe. However, because the argument does not provide an ontological basis, it cannot be used to indicate an ontological conclusion, such as an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being. Even if the argument did indicate ontological conclusions, the origin of the universe could be explained by any of the mutually exclusive ontological conclusions listed earlier. The evidence of the Big Bang is tentative empirical evidence, and therefore it is insufficient to justify the claim of an eternal, all-powerful cause, a metaphysical conclusion. However, the empirical tentative evidence of the Big Bang is sufficient to justify the claim that the universe has an empirical tentative cause. Now let's move on to the ontological arguments. Premise 1. God is a being that nothing greater can be imagined. Premise 2. A being that exists in reality is greater than a being that only exists as an idea. Conclusion. Because God is by definition something which nothing greater can be imagined, and a God that only exists as an idea is not as great as a God who exists in reality, God therefore exists in reality. Ontological arguments commit a category error between the conceptual and ontological tier, and they fail for the reason of Agrippa's trilemma. This is because there is no basis for concluding any particular conception or definition of the word greatest or maximally great is any more ontologically accurate than any of the mutually exclusive ontological definitions. These alternative definitions could indicate any of the alternative ontological conclusions to theism. These alternative definitions could include definitions that disprove the existence of God, such as the claim that the greatest being is the one that can do the most with the least amount of power. Therefore, a being who created the universe without existing would be the greatest, therefore God does not exist. None of the definitions that we come up with in our mind about what is the greatest or the maximally great qualifies to justify belief in a metaphysical conclusion. Let's move on to the teleological arguments. Premise 1. The fine-tuning of the universe is either due to chance, physical necessity, or design. The fine-tuning is the fact that a universe conducive to life occurring has a probability of 1 in X, some very large number, because if the physical constants were changed, life could not occur. Premise 2. The fine-tuning is not due to chance or physical necessity. Conclusion, therefore, the fine-tuning is due to design. The biggest problem of this argument is the fact that it claims that something is improbable, therefore it must be designed. The improbability of complexity in life being 1 in X tells us nothing, because even though that 1 in X may be the least likely outcome, it could also be equally as likely as all the other outcomes, or even the most likely outcome. Life and complexity being the least likely outcome is kind of like a coin with the width of 1x landing on its edge, which is essentially the apologist's argument that it's so improbable it must have been designed. Life having an equally likely chance of occurring as all other possibilities would be kind of like a dice with x sides landing on any side. This would be analogous to the argument by Victor Stinger, who claimed that even though changing one constant may result in a non-life-permitted universe, changing multiple congruent constants may result in infinitely many possible life-permitting combinations of constants. Life being the most likely or even a necessary outcome would be kind of like a dice with 2x sides and 2 sides filed together, landing on the sides that have been filed together. This would be analogous to Steven Weinberg's arguments that constants may be interconnected, and changing any one may result in a proportional change to the others, like in the case of the weak and the electromagnetic force, which we now know are the same force. Without an understanding of the environment and the underlying mechanisms causing the apparent fine-tuning, we cannot rule out chance or necessity, as both of which have a basis in physics where design does not. Also, apologists' current attempts to the definition of design fail to be ontological because they only incorporate known empirical forms of life complexity and not all possible ontological forms of life complexity. Because metaphysical or ontological claims require metaphysical evidence, and apologists are only using empirical examples in their definition of design, that definition can only indicate empirical designers that lack absolute properties, such as aliens or simulated universe programmers. Moreover, apologist definition cannot be used to indicate an ontological designer, such as an all-powerful God. Even if life complexity could indicate an ontological conclusions, when compared to the ontological possibilities of life complexity, which may include non-physical life, our empirical definitions of life complexity may be indicative of any of the mutually exclusive ontological conclusions listed earlier. The empirical evidence of the apparent fine-tuning of the constants is insufficient to justify belief about any claims about a metaphysical conclusion. However, the empirical evidence of the apparent fine-tuning of the universe is sufficient to justify empirical conclusions such as those proposed by Victor Stinger or Steven Weinberg. Let's move on to the moral argument. Premise 1. Without God, there is no objective basis for morality. Premise 2. Morality is objective. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Moral arguments commit a category error between the conceptual and ontological tiers, and they fail for the reason of Agrippa's trilemma, the problem of the criterion, and the problem of the universals. Essentially, what this means is that we have no basis to conclude there is such thing as an objective morality, and even if there was, any of the mutually exclusive ontological conclusions listed earlier could be the basis of that objective morality. For example, naturalistic pantheism, which is the multiverse or cyclic universe, can claim to have a basis in objective morality in a super law, simply one we haven't discovered yet. The fact that we all experience morality is conceptual evidence and therefore does not justify belief in a metaphysical conclusion of objective morality. However, the conceptual evidence of the morality we all experience is sufficient to justify belief in a subjective morality. Let's move on to the historicity of the Bible and the resurrection of Jesus. Historical claims, which are a form of testimony, are by definition conceptual, and therefore because empirical claims require empirical evidence, historical claims cannot be used to justify belief of the events empirically occurring, rather than just being a product of someone's imagination based purely on conceptual evidence of historical testimony. If I told you I saw a real living breathing unicorn, you should not believe me. However, if I told you I saw a real living breathing dog, then you should believe me. This is because even though I have not provided any explicit empirical evidence for either the dog or the unicorn, we have implicit empirical evidence for dogs, and therefore I do not need to provide an explicit empirical basis for the claim to be reasonable to accept based on testimony. Unicorns do not have implicit empirical evidence, therefore they would require explicit empirical evidence before they are reasonable to believe from testimony. Historical claims work the same way. If claims already have an implicit empirical basis, then they are prima facie reasonable to accept. If they do not have an implicit empirical basis, then an explicit basis must be provided before they would be reasonable to accept. Therefore, miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the supernatural, paranormal, aliens, and similar would all need an explicit empirical basis before they are reasonable to accept based on historical testimony or conceptual evidence. However, it is reasonable to believe such claims to be delusions or misconceptions, as those are conceptual conclusions and therefore only require conceptual evidence, such as historical testimony that lacks an empirical basis. The fact that we have historical claims, which only qualify as conceptual evidence, is insufficient to justify the belief that the events empirically occurred in the physical world around us. However, the conceptual evidence of historical claims are reasonable to justify belief in delusions or misconceptions, as those are also conceptual conclusions. A common rebuttal to this principle is that if it is true, all history is unreliable. This is false, because this principle only applies to things that lack an empirical basis. Therefore, all historical claims about things we already know are empirically possible are prima facie reasonable to accept. Historians have additional criteria to judge historical claims, therefore something simply being empirically possible does not necessarily make it reasonable to accept, which is why I say it's only prima facie reasonable. A similar argument was presented by Hume and Hitchens. As Hume stated it, there is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves. As Hitchens phrased it, what is more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you have made a mistake? Neither Hitchens nor Hume were historians, so what do the historians have to say? The Christian historian, Michael Licona, in his paper Historians and Miracle Claims, says, most biblical scholars and historians hold that the investigation of miracle reports lie outside of the rights of the historian acting within their professional capacity. This definition is espoused by R.G. Collingwood, Geoffrey Elton, J.H. Hexter, and more recently by Robert Webb. In the same paper, Licona quotes Robert Webb's justification for this position. Definitional limitation. What is usually understood to constitute history is not making an ontological statement about the totality of reality. Those whose worldview includes a supernatural realm and the possibility of theistic causation may respond in two different ways. They may define the breadth of history to include the possibility of divine causation, or they may view this understanding to be a definitional limitation of the modern discipline of history and how it functions without it being an ontological statement about the nature of reality. This latter view I could call methodological naturalistic history, In other words, for the purposes of doing historical work, the historian is methodologically limited to causation within the physical space-time universe. But this does not limit the historian's personal ontological worldview, just his or her historical method as a historian. In conclusion, there are three types of knowledge: conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical. Claims in one tier require evidence of the same tier. Apologists are making metaphysical claims without providing any metaphysical evidence, therefore their claims are unsupported, and any of the mutually exclusive metaphysical conclusions are equally or more plausible than theism. As far as I know, there is no metaphysical basis of knowledge with the possible exceptions of solipsism, math, and logic, which could all be explained by any of the mutually exclusive metaphysical conclusions to theism. Therefore, either we can accept methodological naturalism, science, as the highest form of knowledge that we have, or we can extrapolate to an ontological conclusion, in which case theism is no more supported than any of the mutually exclusive ontological conclusions, including the spaghetti monster. Thanks for taking the time to watch my video. If you liked it, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, if you have any suggestions on how I can improve or criticisms, please be sure to let me know. If you really like my video, please feel free to donate to my Patreon account so I can spend more time making videos like these.